In a dark stone room, the light from several clay lamps flickers. Sand soaked in resin is scattered on the floor, and hieroglyphs flicker on the walls. In the center is a body. A person who was breathing yesterday is now part of a ritual. A priest leans over it, holding a thin instrument in his hand. His movements are calm and practiced. To a modern person, this would seem eerie, even cruel. For the Egyptians, it was a sacred rite, the first step toward immortality. The body is washed with fragrant wine, sprinkled with special salt, and wrapped in dozens of meters of linen soaked in resin. Everything is done for one purpose, so that the soul can pass into the afterlife. Try to imagine this scene. The thick smell of resin and incense, a priest working intently, like a master sculptor. What you see before you is not just death. What you see before you is an attempt to defeat it. And this is where our journey begins. In Egypt, death was prepared as a technology of eternity. In Tibet, the body was given back to nature, considering it an act of mercy. And in Europe during the plague, death became a threat that had to be eliminated. 3 cultures, 3 different ways of looking at the end of life. And this whole story will show that death has never been just biology. It has always been religion, politics, and a way to control even that which cannot be subjugated. Imagine a room where dozens of bodies are in various stages of rebirth. One has already dried and is waiting for bandages. Another is still giving off moisture after being washed. In the corner are clay canopic jars with lids in the shape of gods' heads. These are where the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines will be placed. Mummification took about 70 days. First, the body was cleaned of everything unnecessary. The heart was usually left. It was considered the center of the soul. But according to legend, if a person was suspected of serious sins, it could be removed so that there would be nothing to weigh on the scales of truth in the afterlife. Next, the body was washed with palm wine, rubbed with resins, and covered with natron, a special salt that dried out every cell. After a few weeks, it became as hard as wood. Then it was wrapped in dozens of layers of resin-soaked linen and turned into a shiny doll, ready for eternity. The smells were heavy. Incense and resin filled the room with a dense wave. To us, it may seem suffocating. For the Egyptians, it was the scent of immortality. But not everyone could afford such luxury. The poor were simply wrapped in mats and buried in the sand. The irony is that they were often better preserved than the kings. The sun and dry sand were ideal mummifiers. Let's remember the young pharaoh Tutankhamun. His tomb was found almost intact. Sarcophagi, jewelry, a golden mask, everything remained untouched. Death for him was not the end, but the beginning of a journey, where he was to be accompanied by treasures and even symbolic servants. In Egypt, death was an indicator of status. For some, it meant pyramids and eternal fame. For others, it meant anonymous sand. It was their form of control, who would gain immortality and who would disappear forever. Interestingly, even after thousands of years, mummies remained a luxury item. In the 19th century, there was a real mummy boom in Europe. Collectors bought them, displayed them at social parties, and sometimes even forged them. For some, it was a fashion, for others, a business, but the meaning remained the same. Even after death, bodies became an instrument of status and control. Now imagine Europe in the 16th to 17th centuries. Pharmacies sold powder made from ground mummies brought from Egypt. It was called mumia and was considered a universal remedy, from headaches to internal bleeding. Nobles bought it for a lot of money, and whole caravans of mummies traveled from Cairo to Europe. Sounds crazy to us, but back then, death was literally swallowed in the hope of prolonging life. In the highlands of Tibet, the ground is hard and rocky. It's almost impossible to dig graves here. There are no green valleys or deep soils, only cold and wind. That is why one of the most amazing death rituals was born. The body of the deceased lies on the ground. Next to it is a monk in a dark red robe. He is calm. In his hands is a knife, not as an instrument of violence but as part of the ritual. Before him is a sky burial. The body is prepared, cut into pieces, and soon black vultures circle above it. Their cries can be heard from afar. The first one lands on a rock, spreads its wings, and begins to eat. Dozens of others follow. In a few hours, only the memory of the body remains. To us, this sounds horrific. To Tibetans, it is mercy. The body was considered an empty shell. The soul had already left it, and it is better to give the remains to living creatures than to let them disappear without meaning. This ritual was described by travelers as far back as the Middle Ages. Even today, anthropologists observe dozens of vultures surrounding a monk and quickly devouring all that remains of a human being. Consider the contrast. In Egypt, bodies were preserved for dozens of days, as if they were complex projects designed to grant immortality. In Tibet, it was given back to nature, recognizing that true life had already moved on. Here, death had nothing to do with luxury or control. It was the purest form of spiritual ecology. The body feeds the birds take to the sky, and so a part of the deceased re-enters the great circle of life. Imagine the narrow streets of a medieval city. Stone walls, closed shutters, and yet the smell of death permeates them. It is thick, invisible, and even makes warriors, accustomed to blood on the battlefield, feel nauseous. A cart rolls slowly along the cobblestones. The wooden wheels creak, overloaded with bodies. They lie on top of each other. Yesterday they were shopkeepers, neighbors, children. Now they are just a burden that must be disposed of. The driver covers his face with a cloth soaked in vinegar and looks away. His job is to take the dead to mass graves. Such pits were called brotherly graves. Archaeologists still find their remains in London today. In 2013, a burial site with more than 300 bodies was discovered near Charterhouse. There were no crosses or names, only a mass mound where everyone became faceless. This practice of mass burials continued for centuries. In the 18th century, Paris faced a new problem. Cemeteries were so overcrowded that bodies began to literally break through the ground into residential areas. The city authorities made a radical decision. Thousands of remains were transferred to underground quarries. This is how the Paris catacombs were born, where even today you can see walls made of skulls and bones. But this problem was not unique to France. In 18th century London, cemeteries were so overcrowded that neighbors literally lived next to corpses that seeped into the soil and water. On hot days, the smell of death hung over entire neighborhoods. Townspeople complained that they could not open their windows, and doctors warned of the danger of infection. Only later did the authorities begin to move burials outside the city. Let's move on to 18th century England. There, death also became a spectacle. After execution, criminals were not given to their families but to doctors. Their bodies were placed on a table in an anatomical theater. Students and townspeople gathered to watch the professor dissect the dead body. For some, it was education, for others, entertainment. Death became a show that was meant to instill fear and at the same time feed curiosity. Florentine Giovanni Boccaccio wrote in the Decameron, "Brothers abandoned their brothers, wives abandoned their husbands, and parents abandoned their children. No one wanted to touch the dead, because death clung to the body like the plague itself." His words sound like a verdict on an entire era. Imagine the stone steps of a Mayan temple. The sun is scorching, and thousands of people have gathered in the square. In the center is a priest dressed in feathers and black paint. Before him is a captive, tied to the altar. And now, above the crowd, rises the symbol of sacrifice, the heart, which the Mayans considered a sacred gift to the gods. For us, it is horror. For them, it is a necessary ritual. Blood was considered food for the gods, and the heart was a coin with which a person paid for the existence of his people. Now let's move to the northern seas, to the world of the Vikings. When a Kanung or a great warrior died, he did not go alone. A slave girl had to go with him. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan described how the girl was given alcohol to drink, adorned, and proclaimed that she was going to her master. Then she was sacrificed and placed in the grave. This was called marriage in the afterlife. Next, the steppes of Scythia. Herodotus wrote that when a king died, his wives, servants, warriors, and even horses were buried with him. They were killed so that he would not be alone in the afterlife. The king lay in gold, and next to him were dozens of those who had been alive just yesterday. On the other side of the world, China, 210 BC, the first emperor of unified China, Qin Shi Huang, dies. He believed that power continued after death. Therefore, an entire army was placed in the tomb, 8,000 terracotta warriors, each with a unique face. They were to stand guard forever. These were no longer sacrifices of flesh and blood, but the idea was the same: death as a continuation of power. From bloody sacrifices to stone armies, all these rituals had one purpose. They created the illusion of order where chaos reigned, and they gave the feeling that even death could be subjugated to the gods or to power. Imagine a person who has just died. At first, the body looks almost the same as it did in life. But after a few hours, invisible changes begin. The skin turns pale, the blood sinks down and leaves bluish spots, the first sign that life has left the body. A few days pass, and it no longer resembles itself. Its features fade, as if someone invisible is wiping them from memory. Time and nature quickly take their toll, turning a person into a shadow of their former self. It was these changes that medieval chroniclers described when they mentioned mass graves during the plague. These processes were impossible to stop, but each culture tried to combat them in its own way. The Egyptians soaked the bodies in resin and wrapped them in linen to give them the form and smell of eternity. Europeans covered graves with lime to speed up the disappearance of bodies and reduce the threat of disease. Tibetans gave bodies to birds to avoid decay and return them to nature. The Incas rubbed mummies with mountain resins, effectively preserving them. For our ancestors, death was not just a spiritual problem. It had a smell, contaminated water, and brought disease. And every culture sought a way to curb this chaos. With fragrant oils, purification rituals, or even the complete destruction of the body. Imagine that you are a slave in ancient Rome. You have worked for your master your entire life, but after death, you will receive neither a tomb nor a prayer. Your body will be thrown into a pit along with others. The Romans even had a special word for this, puticuli. These were huge pits for the poor and slaves. Bodies were brought there in layers and covered with lime so that they would disappear faster. There, death became faceless. A person disappeared without a name, without memory. Let's move on to medieval Europe. If someone was accused of heresy, their body was burned, not only as punishment, but also so that the soul could not be resurrected at the Last Judgment. It was a way to destroy not only the body, but also the hope for life after death. And so it was almost everywhere. In Egypt, the majestic pyramids and mummification awaited only the pharaohs and priests. Ordinary people were left with only the desert sand. In Tibet, if a family could not afford a heavenly burial, the body was left in the field without a ritual. In Europe during the plague, priests often refused to bury the poor, and they were simply thrown into mass graves without prayer. Think how horrible that is. Even in death, people were divided into worthy and worthless. The body became a weapon of power. Those who were buried with honor were remembered. Those who were thrown into a pit disappeared forever. Here's the scariest part. Death rituals weren't just about belief in the afterlife. They cemented the hierarchy of society. They determined whose memory would live on and whose life would be erased as if it had never existed. Let's return to the dark room in Egypt. The priest bends over the body. His movements are precise, practiced, and he believes that the fate of the soul depends on this work. Now Tibet. A monk in a red robe stands in the mountain wind. Vultures circle above him. He is calm. The body is already empty, and real life has long since flown away. And now Europe, 14th century. A girl stands by a mass grave. Wagons arrive one after another, dumping bodies into a deep pit. She covers her face with a cloth, but the smell of death penetrates it. And she knows, tomorrow she may find herself there. 3 scenes, 3 cultures, but one truth: death has never been just a biological end. In Egypt, it was a technology of immortality. In Tibet, it was an act of mercy and merging with nature. In Europe, it was mass horror where the body became a threat. In each case, death was a way to tame chaos. It determined who would receive eternity and who would disappear without a trace, whose memory would live on, and who would be forgotten as if they had never existed. And perhaps the greatest horror lies not in death itself, but in the fact that the living decide what to do with the dead. Because the story of death is always the story of the lives of those who remain. Imagine this picture. Bells ringing, carts creaking, screams, and the realization that tomorrow you may find yourself among these bodies. The church does not have time to perform funeral services. Monks die along with everyone else. People pray, but the sky is silent. All that remains is horror and silence hanging over the city. And finally, the present day. Today, we no longer embalm, feed vultures, or grind mummies, but the desire to defeat death remains. In the US and China, people pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to be frozen in special capsules after death. They hope that future technologies will revive their bodies. Others create virtual memorials, digital copies of themselves that continue to write messages to their loved ones even after death. It seems that we have come a long way from Egypt or Tibet. But in fact, the idea is the same: death must be cheated.